it is well known and well established that people with serious mental disorders, things like chronic depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, they have much higher rates of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and they are much more likely to die early deaths. On average, they lose about 20 to 30 years of life. But it turns out that people with all mental disorders have higher rates of all of the metabolic disorders. So this includes even people with mild anxiety, ADHD, personality disorders, eating disorders, all of them, all mental disorders. People are losing life. On average, men die 10 years early deaths and women lose 7 years of life.
We have Dr. Chris Palmer in the house today. I'm very excited about that.
Hello, good morning.
Hey, it's good to see you again. It's been a couple of years since we chatted last, and good to see you continuing to make progress and fight the good fight. So how are you this morning? You still out there in Boston, or where are you at these days?
I'm out here in Boston, so it's afternoon now.
That's true. That's true. You're 3 hours time difference. Yeah, it's only 9 a.m. where I'm at. Well, Chris, for those who don't know you, just if you don't mind, a quick introduction of who you are, what you do, if you don't mind.
So I'm Chris Palmer. I am a psychiatrist. I work at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Been here for like 27 years. My regular day job is I'm the director of continuing ed. So I educate other mental health professionals from around the world. And then my kind of passion over the last, really kind of 20 years, but very publicly over the last 6-7 years is using ketogenic diets, or diets in general, to improve mental health in people with serious mental illness, mild mental illness as well. But the serious ones are the ones that I think get the most attention because most people think of them as lifelong disorders that are untreatable, and our treatments are really horrible and abysmal for. So I think it's great when people feel better or a little less depressed or a little less anxious or have more confidence, but it's kind of nothing short of miraculous when somebody with schizophrenia no longer has schizophrenia, or somebody with bipolar disorder no longer has that. So that's kind of what I've been doing. And I think the most exciting the thing that I'm most excited about is that I've got a book coming up called Brain Energy. And the book presents, for the last 6 years, I've been doing a deep dive into the science to try to understand how the hell does a diet put something like schizophrenia into remission? Because that seems pretty impossible. And it certainly goes against everything that the medical field currently thinks. And so the book presents a new theory of what causes mental illness. And essentially, in a nutshell, I am arguing that all mental disorders are metabolic disorders of the brain.
Yeah, I look forward. When is that going to be out, Chris? I look forward to reading that. When's that coming out?
Comes out in November.
Awesome. Well, awesome. We're excited about that, and I'll certainly be looking forward to sharing that with other folks. I want to, I'll just make a couple of statements here. I want your comments. So you just said, one of the things I wanted to ask about was, is there a relationship between metabolic disease and mental health? And, obviously you alluded to that. That seems to be the case. That's the premise of your book. Also, there's a thought that there is some sort of relationship between the gut and mental health. And of course, diet is going to impact both of those things. Diet impacts our metabolic health, and diet impacts our gut health. What basis by which you say the evidence shows either the cardiometabolic or the metabolic disease or gut health? What is the basis for making an assumption that will impact our mental health?
So it's a great question, and the real answer is that's what I have shoved into like 350 pages, mm-hmm. and a lot of them I had to do a whirlwind tour. So I'll give you the quick overview and then try to give you the consolidated answer. The connections between mental illness and metabolic illness, like diabetes, for instance, or obesity, they go back to at least the 1800s. And so, it is well known and well established that people with serious mental disorders, things like chronic depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, they have much higher rates of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and they are much more likely to die early deaths. On average, they lose about 20 to 30 years of life. But it turns out that people with all mental disorders have higher rates of all of the metabolic disorders. So this includes even people with mild anxiety, ADHD, personality disorders, eating disorders, all of them, all mental disorders. People are losing life. On average, men die 10 years early deaths and women lose 7 years of life. And most people assume, especially with the serious mental disorders, most people assume, well, it's the pills that we're prescribing. Because antipsychotic, mood stabilizing medications, and even a lot of antidepressants cause weight gain and they cause diabetes. And there's no doubt that that's true. It is true. But even when people get first diagnosed before they even get one pill, we can already measure signs of insulin resistance and metabolic problems in them. And again, these observations have been made since the 1800s before we even had any of these pills. So the pills are definitely making things worse, but these connections exist before people even get one of the pills. So those connections have been known for a long time, but a lot of people just write those off because they think the reason anybody would be obese or diabetic or have a heart attack is because they're a lazy slob. They're overeating, they're under-exercising, and they're just lazy slobs. And so everybody thinks the same thing about the mentally ill. Well, they're lazy slobs too. They must be overeating, under-exercising, and just sitting on the couch, feeling depressed or psychotic or whatever, and not taking care of themselves. And that's what most people think right now. But it turns out that if you do a deep dive into the science, and when I say science, I mean everything. So we have over 70 years of basic science research, meaning researchers took blood samples from people with mental illness, or they've done brain scans on people with mental illness. It's the whole range. So based on blood samples, based on metabolic biomarkers, and based on brain scans, all of that research, all of it strongly gives a very clear message that people with mental disorders, even before they get one pill, already have metabolic problems in their cells. And this includes their brain cells, but it also includes their muscle cells and even their blood cells, like their white blood cells and sometimes even their red blood cells. The white blood cells in particular are often dysfunctional in a metabolic way. And so what I do in this book is I bring all of this science together. And as you said, it involves a lot more than just the basic science. It involves the gut. It involves a lot of hormones like insulin, but also cortisol and other hormones. It involves all of these different things that end up influencing both mental health and metabolic health. And once people, I think, understand it, it offers obvious new treatments and new solutions.
Chris, how strong, like, is the relationship, is it safe to say that people that have, fully diagnosed diabetes have a higher prevalence of certain mental health disorders and severity versus someone who may be early pre-diabetic or just, like some people like call diabetes in situ hyperinsulinemic? Is there a pretty linear correlation? The worse the metabolic disease, the worse the mental health?
Yes. So the best evidence, the strongest and most robust evidence looks at one of the more common mental disorders, which is depression. So, and for those of you who don't know, depression is actually the leading cause of disability in the United States and on the planet. And it is the second most common chronic health disorder, second only to obesity. So depression is now more prevalent than diabetes or prediabetes. And so the relationship between, so if someone has diabetes, they are 2 to 3 times more likely to have clinical depression. But when they get it, it ends up lasting 4 times longer than it does in people who don't have diabetes. And what that means is that at any one time, about 25% of people with diabetes are experiencing symptoms of clinical depression. A lot more are on antidepressants and other medications to try to treat that depression. And sometimes those medications help and work. And so those people aren't officially experiencing symptoms of depression, even though they're getting treatment for it. But if we look at it the other way, so people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, they're 3 times more likely to have diabetes. One of the more powerful studies that was just done, it was a longitudinal study, took place over 25 years. So they followed these kids from the age of 1 until 24 years old. And the researchers measured their weight and, more importantly, their insulin resistance. And starting at age 9, the kids who had the highest levels of insulin resistance at age 9, so these kids didn't have a mental illness yet necessarily. All they had was high levels of insulin resistance starting at age 9. They were 5 times more likely, that's 500% more likely, to develop schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or be at severe risk for those disorders than the kids with the lowest levels of insulin resistance. And what that tells us is that insulin resistance is probably coming first before the psychosis. So insulin resistance is somehow playing a role in these disorders, and a primary role in these disorders.
There, and I'm sure you've seen this. There was a recent study that just came out, basically analyzing the role of serotonin, and because there's been, just massive amounts of SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, being prescribed over the years, the thought being an imbalance, and that theory has turned out to perhaps be based on not really any good science. And so, is that still part of the current paradigm? And how much are you having to educate your peers? You say you do the CME stuff. What does the average psychiatrist think is a cause of mental health disease?
So yeah, great questions. And I have seen that research. I actually talked about that paradox in my book before that more recent study came out, because we've actually known this for a long time. We've known that there are not chemical imbalances in the brain, not that we can measure. That doesn't mean the medications don't work for some people, but it means that the explanation that we've been given for how and why they work is wrong. So we, I would say that most mental health professionals right now they typically fall into one of 2 categories as to what causes mental illness. A lot of them will say mental illnesses are a chemical imbalance. And that's the neurotransmitters in your brain, and they must be imbalanced somehow or another. And so the treatment is obvious. We need to give you a chemical to balance your neurotransmitters in your brain, and that will hopefully solve the problem. There's another camp that includes some psychiatrists, but is much more heavily, on other mental health professionals, psychologists and social workers in particular. And the other camp says that the cause of mental illness is trauma or neglect or abuse or social adversity. Something terrible or horrible or stressful is happening to human beings. And that, especially if it happens in childhood, and especially if it's severe and unrelenting. And if that happens, then that's the cause of mental illness. And then the treatment is to talk about it, talk about your trauma, process your trauma. And if you process your trauma, everything will get better. For those of you who don't know, I mean, both camps have a little bit of validity in the treatments, meaning that the treatments do sometimes work. So talking to people about trauma, for instance, can work for some people. Giving people antidepressants can work for some people. There's no way to deny that. And I don't feel like we will maintain credibility if we try to say they never work, because they do kind of work, at least for some people. But the explanations for how and why they work are very, very weak. And the reality is that, again, mental disorders are the leading cause of disability on the planet right now. And it's not because people aren't getting treatment. It's because those treatments don't work for most people. And so the pills and the talk therapy simply do not work for the majority of people who are getting those treatments. And that may sound extreme, but I'm quite serious. Like, if most people think depression is a treatable illness. And, we have so many treatments. We got so many antidepressants and shock therapy and talk therapy and everything. Something must be working. Like, we've known about depression for millennia. What the hell? Like, can't we treat that? The reality is, in one large study that followed depressed patients getting treatment, they followed them for 12 years. 90% of the patients were still having symptoms of depression, even though they were all getting treatment. And that treatment ranged from, pills and talk therapy and happy thinking and stress reduction and hospitals and group therapies and everything. 90% were still struggling with depression, even though they were getting some of the best treatments available. And so what I strongly believe is we need an entirely new way to understand mental illness. And once we understand what we're doing, maybe we can have better treatments. And as you all know, in this group, we're going to be talking about diet a lot more.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. I mean, I'm sure you'd have seen a recent study. I think George E., Eric Westman, and a few others published a case series of 31 patients, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar, and depression, and put them all on ketogenic diets, and pretty much all of them saw some improvement. Some went into remission. Did you have any input or insight into that study, or I'm sure you've seen it, I would imagine.
Fairness.
On it.
In fairness, and I don't want to take away from the successes of it, and we'll talk about the successes of it. But as you said, of the patients who were able to do it, so the psychiatrist kind of self-selected 31 patients. So right there's a little bit of bias, because he probably chose people that he thought would be able to do a diet and would be game for it and everything else. And even then, 3 of those patients dropped out early on. They could not do the diet, and they were in the hospital. They were getting spoon-fed this diet, and they couldn't do it. So 10% of the people dropped out right away, even with all of that intensive support, and even though the psychiatrist had the discretion of choosing who he wanted. But of the 28 patients who remained on the study, almost all of them lost weight. Almost all of them experienced improvement in their symptoms. I think 60% officially met criteria for remission of their chronic depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, although they didn't separate which ones got the remission. My suspicion is it was the depressed patients, possibly more often, who got the full remission. But then that gets into the really tricky stuff of, as I said, the current medications that we prescribe, they cause weight gain, they cause diabetes and insulin resistance, they cause cardiovascular disease. We know that. It's on the package inserts. The FDA says that is true. I'm not being a hypocrite by saying that. I'm not being a crazy quack by saying that. It's right on the package insert by the FDA. And ketogenic diets or carnivore diets are trying to reverse those disorders. They're trying to reverse obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular risk factors. But if you have these powerful drugs still that you're taking every day, fighting you against in that battle, that may be interfering with your ability to fully recover or go into remission. And they commented in that study that I think 60% or so were able to reduce meds. They didn't talk about whether they got anybody completely off meds, and they didn't talk about what meds they got people off of. And I think those are really important variables in kind of thinking about how to translate this in real life. Is one of the goals that I have for people when I put them on a diet is if the diet seems to be working for them, what I've found is that they often don't get a miracle cure yet. We have to then try to get them safely off their meds in order to get the miracle cure. And that's hard to do.
Yeah, Chris, interesting point, because you said, we are happy to prescribe antipsychotics, antidepressants up the wazoo. I mean, the number of people on those things is outstanding, right? It's astonishing how many Americans and people worldwide are on these drugs. And like you said, they raise cardiovascular risk. That's a known, complete known. And yet people are saying, oh my God, don't go on this diet because it might raise your cardiovascular risk, even though it provides you probably better benefits. So it's a very hypocritical stance. Now, I want to point out, in the audience today, I see at least two people, Brett and James, both of which have basically put into remission severe depression. Brett had depression with psychotic features. James, bipolar and schizoaffective disorder. They're off all meds and they're doing great. And I mean, it's because of some of the work you've been doing to inspire them, and just diet does have a role. And I've been saying this for several years now to much pushback. I mean, to me, do you get a lot of pushback, Chris? Because I mean, maybe as a psychiatrist, do you have a little more authority to speak on mental health than a stupid orthopedic surgeon like me does? But I mean, it's one of those things where it's amazing to me that we have people in the community that think nutrition and diet has nothing to do with mental health disorders. Is that still a prevailing belief that you run into?
It is. So for the overwhelming majority of human beings on this planet, whether they are mental health professionals or just healthcare practitioners or people with mental illness or families, loved ones, overwhelming majority of people are highly skeptical that diet plays a role in mental illness, and in particular in serious mental illness. So it is a major uphill battle. I will tell you that I take a different approach to try to convince people. I talk about science and cell biology and, metabolism and oxidative stress and neurotransmitter balances and inflammation in the brain and all sorts of stuff that maybe some people in the, in the non-medical community wouldn't understand, but people in the medical community understand it. And certainly researchers understand it. And that ends up buying me a lot of credibility. And so the way that I've been able to get a lot of credibility, and I've been able to get a lot of people to take this seriously, is I draw on all of the decades of research that we have in the neurology field, because they've been studying the ketogenic diet for a century now and trying to figure out how the hell does this work? Like, how the hell does a diet stop seizures when all of our pills won't? And so we actually have a tremendous resource in the neurology literature to tap into and to defend, like, hey, this diet stops seizures, so it's not really that far-fetched to think it might help mental disorders, because we use seizure treatments all the time in psychiatry for a wide variety of disorders, including and very prominently serious mental disorders like bipolar disorder in particular and chronic depression. We use those treatments all the time in tens of millions of people. And so I personally, when I give talks, usually people are really excited about it. But I find that, even sometimes people who listen to my talk will then go say to somebody else, hey, I heard that the keto diet can cure schizophrenia. And then everybody thinks they're a quack for saying that because they don't know all this science. They don't know how to defend it in the way that I do. I'm like a high-powered lawyer, if you want to think about it in that way, who can use big words and big language to try to defend what you all already know, probably. So I'm just putting it in a language that makes it defensible. But for instance, I'm talking with the National Alliance for Mental Illness and the American Psychiatric Association. I'm talking on one of their webinars later today. They actually invited me, but it's funny because they have warned me up and down. You've got to be cautious about this ketogenic diet. You can't be telling everybody to go out and try it on their own. This sounds dangerous. I'm like, calm down, people. But yeah.
So in your model, let's say you can convince all the psychiatrists and mental health providers in the country to sort of take this seriously and consider the metabolic consequences. How do you work somebody up? I mean, are there, before I think that a dietary intervention is going to work, what do I need? What information do I need to know? Am I doing some labs, testing their metabolic health, and then going from there and tailoring from there? How does that work for you?
So those right now, those are the $1 million questions. And I want to see a sea change in the mental health field. And I want exactly those kinds of things that you just mentioned. As soon as somebody gets diagnosed with a mental disorder, I want to be running labs to try to understand what is causing this person's metabolic brain dysfunction. That's the way I think about it. So there's something going on with metabolism that's interfering with their brain function. And I would want to understand what that is. And so we might look at insulin resistance, for instance, and we have tons of research already existing and some of it that I talked about a little bit ago that shows that high levels of insulin resistance impair brain function and can even cause psychosis. It can cause depression. It can cause anxiety. So I'd want to know that because that would be a really useful biomarker. And then if we put them on some diet, I would want to see if that's improving, because that would be really helpful to really help somebody fully recover. But there are rare things or less common things that can cause metabolic problems. So I'll give you two examples. So, and these are very well established. So this isn't speculation. So people who have low levels of thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is like one of the master metabolic hormones. And if you have low levels of thyroid hormone, you're more likely to be gaining weight, to get diabetes, and to be at risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's well established. But you're also more likely to develop mental disorders. Which ones? Pretty much depression is the one most people think of, but bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and others are also associated with low levels of thyroid hormone. The treatment for that is replacing the thyroid hormone or putting somebody on a diet. And I know that there are at least case reports or anecdotes of people who say that their autoimmune thyroid disorder went away on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet or other diet. But I've also talked with some patients who have done ketogenic or carnivore diets and their autoimmune thyroid disorder did not go away. And so they will probably need thyroid hormone. And that's the way to cure or help improve their metabolism. Another common problem, or another maybe not so common problem, is vitamin B12 deficiency. So some people become vitamin B12 deficient because they're not eating enough animal sourced foods. So if you are a vegan, you are at high risk for B12 deficiency if you're not taking a B12 supplement. And people with vitamin B12 deficiency are more likely to develop all sorts of mental disorders and metabolic disorders. And they can sometimes develop very severe neurological disorders that can become permanent even. And the treatment for that is to make sure that they're getting enough B12. But there's another kind there's another cause of B12 deficiency, which can be an autoimmune disorder. So there's this thing called intrinsic factor that your body needs to absorb vitamin B12. So some people are eating more than enough vitamin B12 in their food. They're eating a lot of meat, but they can't absorb it because of this autoimmune problem they've got. And those people would need vitamin B12 injections in order to solve their metabolic problem. So those are like a couple of rare things. And I would want to screen people for those. But the real answer, as you know, is the majority of metabolic problems can be solved through diet and other lifestyle interventions. That if you're eating a lot of crappy food, if you're not exercising at all, if you're not getting good sleep, you are going to be metabolically impaired. And the treatment for that is to restore all of those things. It's not just do a good diet. You also do have to be getting good sleep. You also do have to, you should be exercising somewhat. You might want to be getting some light in your eyes during the day and avoiding light at night. Just common sense things that all play a role in metabolism.
Why, just interestingly enough, because, you mentioned obesity is very commonly associated with mental health disorders. And do all diets, because, people will say it's just, it's basically a physics problem, calories in, calories out. If we put you in an energy deficit, you're going to lose weight. You can lose weight on a low-fat diet. You can lose weight on a high-fat diet. Does one seem to have more superiority than that? I know because you're sort of biased towards a ketogenic diet. Could someone who has, fairly severe bipolar disorder just go on a low-fat diet, lose weight, get thinner, and clear up their schizophrenia? Is there something unique to the ketogenic style diet, and what is it if so?
I believe there does seem to be something unique to the ketogenic diet. And the strongest basis that I have to say that is that the ketogenic diet, and maybe very low glycemic index diets, those in particular have been shown to stop seizures when nothing else does. And that's just a very clear-cut disease. Like seizures are a real thing. We can measure them. They cause suffering. They can ruin people's lives. They can kill people, actually. So seizures are real. And yet a ketogenic diet and sometimes a very low glycemic index diet can stop seizures. There is zero evidence, none, that the Mediterranean diet or a low-fat diet or simply losing weight or a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet can stop seizures. There is none. There are no case reports. I personally am not aware of any anecdotes even of people saying, I went on a low-fat diet and my seizures stopped. But we have tens of thousands of people who had treatment-resistant seizures, and the ketogenic diet stopped those seizures. So there is, and we have, again, a lot of evidence to understand why and how that works. So a ketogenic diet or an extremely low carbohydrate diet, which would include a carnivore diet, is in some ways it mimics the fasting state in the human body. And the fasting state, although a lot of people think about going without food as a terrible thing, when people fast, it actually has a lot of healing potential. It stimulates this thing called autophagy, which is basically all the cells in your body start cleaning house, getting rid of old parts and defective things and replacing them with new ones. And so very low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets tend to stimulate a lot of these processes, in a really easy to understand ways. Low carb, ketogenic, carnivore diets will improve insulin resistance. We know that. And insulin resistance is playing a role. So if we're doing a low fat diets actually can sometimes make insulin resistance even worse. Even if you're losing weight on a low fat diet, if you're on a low fat diet and eating a lot of processed carbohydrates or, a lot of sugar and other things like that, your triglycerides can still go up, your HDL can still go down, your insulin resistance can go up. So your metabolism can actually still be getting worse, even if you're losing some weight. And I personally was a victim of that because I bought into the whole low fat diet thing, 25 years ago. And I was a victim of that. I was doing a low fat diet and my metabolism was going to shit. And, and it did not sit well with me. So I do think there's something special about low carb, keto, carnivore diets.
What do you think about serum cholesterol and its associations between suicidality, violent crime, mental health issues? We see people with it seems to be lower levels. Maybe I'm not sure, maybe some of the literature is mixed, but they're now in the cardiology literature, they're saying that you can have a serum cholesterol of 25 milligrams per deciliter without negative consequence in the short term. That's what they say you can safely be at. And yet I see some of the psychiatric literature that says, hey man, you get too low and you start having some mental health issues. Is there anything, does cholesterol play a role? Serum cholesterol have any role in our mental health?
It's almost like you're a stand-up comic by asking that question. So for those of you who don't know, cholesterol is actually one of the backbones of a lot of cells in the human brain. Neurons incorporate cholesterol into their membranes, and they're actually a really important part of the cell. The human brain is a very fatty organ, or lipid-rich organ is what somebody would say. So it contains a lot of fat and cholesterol. For those of you who also don't know, although cholesterol, most people think about it as, it's just this thing floating around in your bloodstream that's related to heart disease or not. Cholesterol is actually the backbone of some really important hormones like testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and cortisol,
vitamin D.
So without cholesterol, we would not have those hormones, which means we would not be reproducing as a species, which means lots of other things. So cholesterol is essential. It is essential to human health. There is no way around it. It is in particular essential to brain health. And we do have some studies showing that when they use statins, for instance, to lower cholesterol levels in extreme ways, it ends up conferring risk. Some studies have said doubles the risk for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And so although the cardiologists might actually be right, because the heart is a very lean organ, the heart is lean muscle, and it is extremely metabolically demanding muscle. I mean, the heart actually is the number one metabolically demanding organ in the human body. A lot of people think it's the brain. The brain is number two. Unfortunately, as a psychiatrist, I happen to love the brain, so it pains me to say that, but the heart is number one. But it's lean, meaning the heart might do better or may not be affected in one way or another with cholesterol levels. But the brain absolutely is. And at the end of the day, quality of life is all about your brain function. I mean, you can be a vegetable and still alive. Your heart can be pumping, and you can be in a vegetative state in a bed. That is no life. And I know that's kind of extreme and exaggerated, but having Alzheimer's disease and having your heart still pump is not necessarily an ideal outcome for any human being. So I think the cardiologists are really misguided. They need to think about the whole human body and not just the heart. And that's with me even saying that what they're saying is true. And I actually, as you and many others know, that data is very flawed and weak at best. it is not at all clear that lowering LDL cholesterol in particular is going to do a whole lot for heart disease. I think lipids play a role. So triglycerides play a role in heart disease. HDL cholesterol probably does. And LDL cholesterol might in like a 10% increased risk kind of thing. And that, if it does, I suspect it's probably about having high levels of LDL cholesterol in the context of high levels of inflammation and insulin resistance. So if people have high levels of insulin resistance and inflammation, it means their arteries are probably also inflamed, and that might make them more porous to LDL cholesterol for some reason. And some of that LDL cholesterol can seep in places where it really shouldn't be. And maybe that can cause problems. I don't know. But as you all know, it's a huge hot potato, and the debates are crazy and really kind of almost violent.
Yeah, it is. It's very contentious. Let me ask you about, because you brought up Alzheimer's disease and some of these neurodegenerative dementia type things. And there's some people that would suggest the etiology by which you're describing for mental health disorders also contributes to that. That is to say, Alzheimer's is brain insulin resistance or something along that. Is there a relationship between those that are diagnosed with depression, midlife, or something like that, and those that go on to develop neurocognitive disorders like dementia? Is there a relationship that you're aware of?
Yes, and so I actually talk about this in the book. I talk primarily about mental disorders, but I include both epilepsy and Alzheimer's disease as diseases that most people think of as neurological disorders that have very, very strong relationships with mental illness. So for instance, people with depression earlier in life, at any point in life, are about 2.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease when they get older. But if you have schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia, if they live to the relatively young age of 66, they are 20 times more likely to also have Alzheimer's disease on top of their schizophrenia. 20 times more likely. We've got one large population study of over 7 million people. It's not just depression and schizophrenia. It's all mental disorders. All mental disorders, anxiety, ADHD, all of them increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease. But it goes the other way around. Right before people get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, in addition to like some forgetfulness and memory impairment, almost all of them start having mental symptoms. A lot of them will get depressed. They'll get anxiety or panic attacks. And everybody's like, why is grandpa getting so depressed? Like nothing's changed. His life is good. But all of a sudden, out of the blue, he's getting all depressed. And he's really getting forgetful now. Those are the hallmark starting symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in the majority of people. Not just forgetfulness, but also mental symptoms. Once Alzheimer's disease is full-fledged in motion, once it is fully diagnosed, pretty much 100% of those people will have mental symptoms. They will have depression, anxiety, agitation, insomnia. 40 to 50% of people with Alzheimer's disease have hallucinations and delusions. And those are the hallmark symptoms of what we call schizophrenia. So you really cannot talk about Alzheimer's disease without talking about mental illness. And you can't talk about mental illness without talking about Alzheimer's disease. They are inseparable, even though Alzheimer's disease is definitely related to age. There's something about the aging process that is playing a role. But because most, 10-year-olds do not get Alzheimer's disease ever. Like that's extremely rare. So I'm not saying that mental illness and Alzheimer's disease are identical things, but brain metabolism is playing, I think, a predominant role in both disorders. And given the overlap in symptoms both ways, I don't think there's any way you can really talk about one disorder without talking about another.
Yeah, and you mentioned you don't see 10-year-olds, but I think we probably already starting to see 40-year-olds that are developing Alzheimer's disease. Is it fair to say that we're seeing a big shift downward among mental health disorders? Are younger and younger people being diagnosed with mental health disorders compared to maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago?
It is a catastrophe right now. In the same way that we see skyrocketing rates of obesity and diabetes, we are seeing skyrocketing rates of mental illness, in particular in youth. So in youth over the last 20 years, the rates of autism have at least tripled. The most recent data, especially over the last 4 or 5 years with the pandemic included, rates went up. Rates probably doubled just in the last 4 to 5 years. So rates of autism are skyrocketing, but rates of ADHD are skyrocketing. In fact, rates of all mental illness are skyrocketing. So in the youth, over the last about 20 years, rates of serious mental illness. So this includes anything that's kind of disabling. It prevents people from going to school or prevents people from having a job. And that usually means chronic depression, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder. Those rates have doubled in the young population in just 20 years. And so again, it's not surprising. A lot of people question those statistics because, mental illness is just highly stigmatized anyway. And a lot of people are skeptical about mental illness. Everybody must just be faking it. They're just making stuff up. They're just saying they're depressed in order to get disability or in order to get out of school. They're just saying it. And all these people who are saying they're autistic, they're not really autistic. That can't be possible. They're just making shit up. I actually believe for the most part, these people are not making shit up. In the same way that we see skyrocketing rates of obesity and diabetes, the brain is being equally impacted. And these people truly are having these disorders and they are ruining people's lives. And we need a different approach and we need to better understand what we're doing.
Just to put in perspective, the incidence or the prevalence of this, I saw a recent study in the UK where they looked at teens and 20-year-olds, and they saw like a 30 and 40% increase in the number of antidepressants prescribed over the last 3 or 4 years. 40% increase is that's phenomenal in my view. That's amazing. If I'm going to walk around, if I go in the grocery store, Chris, and I run into 100 people, just walking around, how many of them have a mental illness, would you estimate?
It's hard to say right now, honestly, because of the pandemic. The pandemic made everything worse. Before the pandemic, the statistics in the United States were 1 in 5. Mm-hmm. 1 in 5 people. So if I see 100 people, that means 20 people will have a mental illness right here and now. The statistics that have been going since World War II, this is one that's going to probably blow most people away and everybody's going to be skeptical of it. But this statistic has been around since World War II. In America, 50% of all Americans will meet criteria for a mental disorder at some point or another in their life. And that means they will at least go through a period of depression or a period of abnormal anxiety. It's not just, they took a test and they got anxious. It's that for a month or more, they had pretty significant anxiety that was interfering with their ability to function in life.
Is this outside of traumatic event? Let's say your spouse dies. Does that exclude that stuff, or is that included in that?
Unfortunately, it does not. And that's one of the things, honestly, that's one of the things that I take on in my book, is that right now the mental health field lacks common sense. Because exactly the thing you just raised. If your spouse and 2 children that you are madly in love with you still love them, They're tragically killed in a car accident, unexpectedly, out of the blue. And you get depressed. You're allowed to be depressed for 13 days. That's it. If you're depressed at 14 days, you now have a brain disorder called major depressive disorder. And a lot of people will say, well, that's a chemical imbalance. And our field doesn't separate that from people who I believe do have a disorder, who truly are chronically depressed for no good reason. Their brain, in my mind, their brains are malfunctioning. Their brains are doing something that they should not be doing. And that the pathways that produce depression are overactive. They just won't stop. And so I believe that mental illness is a real thing. But right now, the mental health field does not at all even attempt to separate people who are having normal reactions to adversity from mental illness. To give you a more clear and drastic example, if we went to the Ukraine right now today, probably over 90% of that population is suffering from a brain disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder. They've had those symptoms for more than a month.
They're still getting bombed.
And yeah, they're still getting bombed. But the American Psychiatric Association doesn't really give a shit about that. They don't care that those people are still, their lives are still being threatened every day right now. They would say, by the criteria, they would say they've got a brain disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder. And I would say that's bullshit. Like that's not a brain disorder. That is a normal reaction to your life being threatened. But it's not to say that I don't think PTSD is a real thing, because I've talked to Vietnam veterans, their stuff happened 40, 50 years ago, and they are still having nightmares most nights because of what happened to them 40, 50 years ago. Their lives aren't threatened anymore. They haven't been threatened in decades, and they still can't move on. I do think there is such a thing as PTSD, and I do believe it is a brain disorder, and I believe it's based on metabolism. But we in the mental health field don't really separate normal human reactions from brain disorders right now. We lump them all together, and that just makes it a big shit show, honestly.
Yeah. Good. One, Chris, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want to ask one quick question. And I've seen PTSD get better with diet too, which sounds crazy, but I've seen it's on
No?
Who's to say it's not? Ketones. And so, you mentioned ketogenic diet, and part of the ketogenic diet is making ketones, but that's not the only thing the ketogenic diet does. You're restricting certain things, maybe the diet quality changes. Do exogenous ketones have a significant role in the treatment of mental health disorder? I know Alzheimer's disease has been looked at a little bit. There may be some benefit there, but can you drink ketones and make your depression go away? Is that something that's going to happen, or does it have to come through the whole process, do you think?
It's an important question, and one that people are researching. The preliminary research so far says no. Unfortunately, there's no free lunch, so to speak. You can't eat a donut and a bag of chips and just drink a bottle of ketones and think that's going to fix your problems. Yeah. I really wish it was. I wouldn't stand in the way of that happening. If it was really that simple, I would, wouldn't that be great to be able to save the world with you drink your ketones? But unfortunately, it's not so simple. I think that ketones are important molecules unto themselves, and exogenous ketones might actually even be able to play a role in some mental illnesses for like specific situations. If somebody's experiencing extreme panic, they're already doing a low carb, keto, carnivore diet, something happens to them and they're extremely stressed, maybe exogenous ketones might be helpful to them for that, temporary situation. But, the strongest evidence against ketones being a miracle cure, that we have tens of thousands of kids on the ketogenic diet for epilepsy right now. And their parents are not happy about it usually. I mean, the parents are delighted that their kids are no longer seizing, and they are happy to do the treatment, and they are happy to do this diet. But the parents would much rather have the kid drink a bottle of ketones and be able to eat the school lunches along with everyone else. And we don't even have one case report, and I'm not even aware of one anecdotal report of any kid on the planet being able to stop their seizures by drinking ketones and stopping the diet. And trust me, there's zero doubt in my mind. Those parents have already tried that. Like thousands of people have probably tried it, hoping, crossing their fingers that this would be an easier solution than a ketogenic diet. And the fact that we don't have even one case report, or like I said, or even that I'm aware of an anecdote, makes me think that it's not in the ketones. You have to do the diet.
Fair enough. Chris, thank you again. Name me your book again. I know it's coming out in November. And then where do people find you for social media for the time being?
Thanks for having me. So the name of the book is Brain Energy. You can actually, if you're interested in it, you can actually pre-order it now, even on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, whatever. And if you want to find me, the easiest place to find me is my website, chrispalmermd.com. If you're active on social media, I'm probably most active on Twitter. So you could follow me there too.
Chris, thank you. Keep up the good work. I'm excited to see when the book comes out. I'm looking forward to reading it. Have a great day. Keep up the good fight. The rest of y'all take care. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Bye, Chris.
Thank you.